So I will
You
record.
should be able to record locally, I think.
I just did.
Okay, great.
Thank you. And Dwight took the files from last week and put them up on YouTube, and I'll make that known to people who want to relive that again or who missed it. Michael, thanks so much. I really am. I meant to do that, and I'm glad to have the reminder. John?
Yeah. Well, George suggested this topic, and I'm always interested to talk about the safety, especially for small airplanes or for the airlines too. I can do that. And the issue, overall, I think for the flying club that I've been consistent about, this is what George talks about the discussions we have from time to time, is that depending on what you compare us to, somebody's mic is open, it sounds like. Anyway, depending on what you compare the club to, we're actually doing pretty good. If you compare us to the general aviation safety records writ large for the United States, the rate at which we've had incidents and accidents is, last I checked, roughly half of the national average, which I think says something positive. Now, I don't mean to say that we can't do better. I don't at all. I mean, my basic approach is that we have to do better, and we need to focus more on how we can do better. That it's not like resting on your laurels, that's for sure. We have a decent record to work on. We have a relationship with our insurance company, which in a sense validates that. George made the point last week that we have a superb insurance policy negotiated by Dick Kenny and the people he works with that does say something about our accident record. One of the things that we mentioned last week is that the insurance industry in general does not like clubs because they tend to have pretty bad accident rates, and they tend at some point to break down in terms of the safety culture. This is just how it works with flying clubs. So out of all of this, you have to look at the old equation, the old thing that we talk about all the time. How much energy and effort are we willing to and feel responsible to do to raise the bar by small percentages? It's like the second order curve that comes close to going parallel to the axis, that the first 80% are pretty easy to figure out what you're going to do and the bang for the buck is good. The next 10%, it's okay, and now you're up to 90% of whatever you're looking at. The next 5% is much more expensive and only gets you 5%. And we can play the game and say, okay, we're at the 97% level. How much more effort, energy, and money do we have to put into safety to achieve another 1% up to 98%? So that's really what we're talking about here, because the most safe flying club in the world is probably going to be pretty onerous in terms of how often you get to fly and in what conditions and so forth. And I will say that those do exist. There are flight operations that can be very strict about how and when you can fly, depending on your hours and history. And the flying club is pretty lenient about that in general, but it doesn't seem to have bitten us too badly. I have a number of suggestions that I can make, but I think the main thing is that how to have a consciously defined safety culture is really what has to happen. I feel responsible for that. For instance, whenever I teach a ground school, any class, if I don't talk about things in terms of safety, I don't think I've done a good job. But what these boil down to, and many of you know in your own professional situations how they work, that first of all, you do have to have loud and firm direction from the top of the organization. In other words, the board of directors and the officers saying, we will work hard to be have a safety culture that really works, and we'll keep pushing that. One of the problems that clubs have, and many organizations for that matter, is you start off great, but then after 3 or 4 or 5 years, it kind of fades to kind of routine stuff, and it's not first and foremost. It's just kind of in the background. And every safety culture has to work on that to keep it right up front, because success breeds contempt in the sense that if you haven't had a lot of accidents to get your attention, everybody says, well, we're doing just great. And that's where George and I agree for sure, that just because we haven't had a lot of accidents recently, we do not need to pat ourselves on the back. We need to redouble our efforts, because statistically speaking, there'll be one coming up sometime, and we would rather postpone that time by working on it actively. So and perhaps someone who's more active with the club right now can tell me about what our safety officers are doing to other than programs from time to time. What else could we do? And I wrote a paper in 2014, and I gave George a copy to read. Some of you have seen it if you've been in my ground schools, making the comparison between the airlines, which US certified airlines have been ridiculously safe in the last 11 and a half, going on 12 years, in that there's only been one death or serious injury from an aircraft accident of US certified airlines in that time period. It is just unreal. It was not that long ago that the general wisdom was that, okay, we're going to have 2 or 3 accidents a year in the airline industry, and that's just the way it is. We're going to work harder to not have them, but you know, it's never going to get to 0. Well, by God, it has gotten to 0, basically. We're talking about 100 million takeoffs and landings, and one person was killed, and that was a freak accident. That was the turbine blade that came through the casing and happened to spear this guy sitting in a window and in Southwest in a 737. I mean, it wasn't officially termed an accident in the sense that we feel, you know, we think that some accidents happen because somebody is remiss and makes a stupid mistake when they're flying an airplane. But what this says to us is that after all this hand-wringing saying that, well, we know how this works. Every industry has a certain level of accidents and incidents that happen in an industry, and they work on them, but they never can go to 100%. Well, the airlines have done a number of significant things, and I know what they are and how they've achieved it, and they really have done an amazing job at airline safety. And by the way, these things are not technical advances in airplanes. They are pilot training. They are working on issues, human issues, and having realistic expectations and rules that work. So that, to me, that says we in general aviation can also adopt some of this. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. That we should not rest on our laurels, even though we're doing well. We should really push it harder. And I have some very specific suggestions, which I'll leave alone at that point and let George jump in on this. He knows what they are. I've stopped talking, George, in case you don't know it. And you're muted.
Yeah, I am muted. I try to be good about that, but anyway, yeah, we've talked about a lot of these things, and I've had conversations with a number of people who are listening in here tonight. John Gaither and I have gone a few rounds about the way we do club annuals and things like that. I'd like to hear his thoughts. I never want to think that we have it all figured out, but when it comes to insurance, you know, we do make the point that underwriters are not crazy about flying clubs, and the reason is pretty clear. Underwriters don't mind risk. They just don't like risk that's hard to calculate. If I own an airplane, they're going to know everything about me, my credit rating, my pilot history, who I voted for, and they can calculate the risk based on that and the law of large numbers. But with a flying club, they don't know who the heck's flying these airplanes, and they don't much like it. And they also are looking at the numbers constantly. I found this message from Dick Kenny, which I'm going to throw up here. for us. Here we go. This is a message that Kenny sent me back in about 2002, which is a long time ago now, but we had an accident back then. It was a gear up. And Dick basically was saying, Dick Kenny, many of you know Dick, he was a club member for a long time and has been in the aviation insurance business forever. He's now retired, but he was both an advocate for the club and handled, basically brokered our insurance, and is as knowledgeable as anyone you will ever meet about aviation insurance. And he basically was saying to us at this time, you know, I don't know where I'm going to get you guys insurance. And you can look here and see, starting in 88 and 89, here are the premiums we paid every year. And here were the losses. And the losses exceeded the premiums by a significant amount. And as he says, when that goes on for a while, underwriters figure, you know, maybe it will reverse itself over time, but they don't know when we may take our business elsewhere. And as he says, they like on a loss ratio of no more than 70%. And they want 30% off the top to cover their expenses and make some money. And we exceeded that by a considerable margin for a number of years there. And underwriters also have to think about liability. This is basically hull claims here. And if you figure in a liability claim that they had to pay, basically one of our members sued because he was injured in what I would consider a fairly minor way in an accident. But and the underwriters paid out on it. Used to drive Dick crazy that underwriters would just pay out instead of fighting a claim like that. But they're not interested in a lot of legal wrangling. They just want to make money. And so we changed at that time, went with Phoenix. But note here where he concludes, in summary, another claim would probably kill us. If we have another accident this year and there's any possibility of a liability claim resulting, then we must report it. This was a communique that we had about whether we should just self-insure for this accident or whether we should report it. And even then, he says, I'd say there are no guarantees about premiums for next year. The market is too unsettled to make a prediction, which was Dick's very, that's the word from the insurance front. This is something that we face all the time. And when we say that we have to be very vigilant, we have at times been very close to being uninsurable. We've had very good advocates for us in our brokerage, but we've been very close to being uninsurable, at which point we become a marching chowder society and we all just split up what's left and go home. So we have at the same time been complimented by our underwriters for all the work we do to try and be safe, but it's a tough world out there, and all the underwriters do is they do the arithmetic, and they also look ahead, and if they see a lot of fender benders, which we have to report, you can't ever hide something from your underwriter. That will rupture that relationship for good. But they start to see a lot of just fender benders. They start to think, you know, let's get out now before the big one comes, the big one where people get really hurt. There are a lot of liability claims, and it gets ugly. In another insurance situation, had not to do with the club, I had to ask a broker to check with the underwriters and see if they would permit us to do something a little bit outside the policy. And he said, "Oh, don't worry about it, George. Underwriters are happy. They won't have a problem with it." I said, "Of course they're happy. We send them a lot of money every year, and they never hear from us. You know as well as I." Insurance is about what happens when So we talked about statistics a little bit. There,
Chris, I'm on a Zoom right now. Can I call you back in an hour?
if we look at, it is very hard to, it's very hard to look at statistics and compare them, ours with what we see nationally, because even though we fly 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 hours a year and have for many years, those are still pretty small numbers, given what the numerator is in that kind of math for us, because we do have fairly few accidents. And when you look at national statistics, it's difficult because you have to define your term about general aviation, but general aviation includes corporate aviation, business jets, which fly to a higher standard than what we think of as general aviation and have far fewer accidents, although they have some spectacular ones. One fairly recent one involving a NASCAR driver was sort of inexplicable, but so I trust you all are familiar with the Null report, which is produced by a foundation every year, although it usually takes a few years for them to put all the numbers together. And the most recent one I could find quickly today was from 2016. And if you kind of drill down and try to weed out helicopters and corporate aviation and so on, non-commercial fixed wing is about as close as we can get to what we do. And if you look at this, you will see that the accident rate per 100,000 hours of flying kind of goes from anywhere from 5 to 7 year after year after year. It goes a little up some years and a little down some years. And the fatal rate kind of floats along somewhere between 1 and 1.5 per 100,000 hours. And so we see here that in 2016, once they crunched the numbers, they came out with about 5.5 accidents, not incidents, but accidents per 100,000 hours. And a little less than 1 fatal accident per 100,000 hours. And that, if you look a lot of different places, a lot of other statistics here that are pretty interesting. You can see instructional accidents along with personal accidents and break it down in other ways. But flight conditions, day VMC is where everybody has accidents because that's where everybody's flying. We know that. Pilots involved, interesting here. ATPs have plenty of fatal accidents, but you have to ask yourself, who's doing what kind of flying, that sort of thing. So we could talk about those for a long time. And if somebody has an insight to any of these numbers, please speak up. But these numbers, have gone down gradually over time. They spike up a little bit sometimes, but they've been pretty consistent over a lot of years now. I've been following these Null reports for a long time. So in a minute, I'm going to try and walk through some rough back-of-the-envelope calculations about what our accident rates look like. But anybody have any comment on those numbers?
They are consistent year after year.
They are, and they're stubborn. And the type of accident varies a little bit from year to year, but what you see is that instructional accidents are at a lower rate. Instruction is pretty safe. The percentage of fatal accidents among instructional accidents is lower as a percentage than it is among non-instructional flying, because by and large, you don't do the dumbass things that we pilots go out and do when you have an instructor aboard, although sometimes the instructor is the instigator of that, but that's not going to happen at the club. But
George,
The accidents are stubborn, and I can speculate as to why they are. Um, John and I have talked about this. It's my contention that you give people better tools, whether it's onboard weather or whatever, and instead of using them to create a greater safety margin, they use them to get greater utility out of their airplane. And that suggests to me we are either comfortable with our level of safety, or we are in denial about it in the belief that it won't happen to us. John makes the point in his ground schools very wisely, I think, that you don't have to be the average pilot. You can beat the odds to a significant extent, but it's harder than we think because a lot of us live in denial. Before I go ahead and look at the club numbers, anybody got any thoughts about general aviation accident statistics, why they are so stubborn or how they relate to us? Or and in a minute, we'll take a look at, again, a back of the envelope calculation as to what our accident rate looks like over the years.
Is there a higher accident that comes out, like VFR pilots going into weather they shouldn't, or any sort of accident that stands out above all else?
Yeah, the fatal accident statistics have a lot of the kind of accidents you just, they stand out among the fatal accidents. Most, if you look at the numbers, and John will undoubtedly have some insight into this, but if you look at the numbers, most general aviation accidents are fender benders. They are botched landings. You can stand beside the runway any day and sort of pick out the airplanes that are headed that way. But most of them are fender benders, bad landings. They are expensive and they've been troublesome to the club. And when we look at the accidents catalog years at the club, you will see that they have been troublesome to the club, but we make them our points of emphasis. One year it'll be, flat tires, and next year it'll be porpoise. Well, it's always porpoise landings. That has cost us a lot in years past, but seldom are people hurt, at least at the club, doing those. You can go out on YouTube and find some spectacular footage of people who were hurt with porpoise landings. But yeah, continued VFR into IMC is the classic loss of control accident. And we have had, we have never actually had, depends on how you want to look at the 1988 Cherokee 6 accident. It was clearly a loss of control accident, but there were contributing factors. And I have pulled up the NTSB reports for a number of things that have happened to the club, and we can look at those and analyze those. We've never had a pure loss of control in IMC accident, but people worry about what happens if the engine quits. I'm really proud to say, and Ryan and John are two of the people responsible for this, but in all of the years at the club, to my knowledge, we have never had an accident due to a maintenance issue, which I think is pretty great, and it gives me a lot of comfort. But people always wonder, well, what happens if the engine quits?
George, if you don't mind me asking, maybe it's personal, but tell your story about your time over Tri-Cities in IMC when your engine caused some problems.
Well, thank you, John. My goal here is not to tell my personal stories, but there is something in that I think there are a number of lessons in it, and I'll really cut to the chase. I was flying back from Memphis, someplace like that. There was a frontal situation. I had oxygen. I was in a Mooney, Club Mooney, and I kept climbing and climbing to get out of the icing because there was icing in the frontal weather. And I'm finally up at 15,000 feet or something, and it's 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and the engine quits. And so, there I was, just me and the bear. I'm sitting on top of 15,000 feet of ice and clouds at night over the mountains. And to put the long story short, dead sticking down through 15,000 feet of icing and doing a dead stick landing in Johnson City, Tennessee at 2 o'clock in the morning. As much as I might think of myself as a pilot, that would not have ended well. However, because of time I spent hanging out in the hangar and asking John questions for 30 years, I was aware of a little documented phenomenon with the Mooney that causes, if some part of the fuel induction system ices up, part of it, John can explain this much better than I can, but I knew enough at least to know that there was part of the fuel system, the fuel metering system in the Mooney that measures the incoming air. And if that ices up, it can be the rough equivalent of just screwing your mixer knob out to idle cutoff, which is what had happened to me. Not that I unscrewed the mixture, but it had just strangled the fuel flow down to the point where the engine quit. And after I finished with the requisite panic and declared an emergency, I realized what had possibly happened, did all the other things, switch fuel tanks, all that stuff, and realized that, if I just restored enough fuel flow, I might get it started again, and I did, and proceeded to decide what to do, and figured going down through the icing wasn't a good option. So, but, I tell that story often just because I was saying just earlier on this call with Tim Lovedahl that I think of everybody in the club, particularly those with highly specialized knowledge like our maintenance people. I think of all of us as part of the training program, and people like Ryan and John and James Garlick a few years back have taught me so much, and occasionally things that have actually, let's just say, contributed to the solution of a problem that otherwise might not have ended well. So is that the question you were asking, John?
Sorry, I'm a little slow on unmuting. Yeah, I just thought that there was a lesson in there that, you go to maintenance nights and you oil the hinges, but there's also a heck of an opportunity to learn, and at some point it may save your bacon.
I could tell a number of other stories along those lines, but that's why, it frustrates the heck out of me that I cannot get more people to go to maintenance night, although I'm not sure that would make Ryan's life any easier, particularly now with Zach gone. But that is just such a rare opportunity, having owned a few airplanes. I know how that works. You've got a problem with your airplane, you take it to the shop, they say, thank you, get lost, we'll call you when it's ready, and we'll send you the bill. The opportunity to actually participate in maintenance, even if it's fairly mundane sort of things, and just be in that environment and ask questions, is an incredibly valuable opportunity that is afforded our club members. And I wish I could get more of them to appreciate it, but you do what you can do.
That brings up an issue, George, that in terms of the safety culture that I'd like to raise, and that is, in an ideal world, like perhaps the airlines right now, when they have no choice because they're employees and they are told by management how things are going to come down safety-wise, what the procedures are, and so forth. It's based on best practices and so forth. But this is the kind of thing I think that clubs like ours face. We make this available, but it's always been a certain type of person who's interested in that. It would be interesting to see if those who have attended maintenance nights regularly, doesn't have to be a huge study because we don't have that many accidents, are the ones who are having accidents or not. But your point is well taken. And there is an issue that a safety culture might say, okay, we really believe that this is useful and helpful, and so we're going to demand that everybody in the club goes to, pick a number, X numbers of maintenance nights per quarter, and make it mandatory. That's kind of starting the safety culture and saying, okay, we're gonna force this, rather than just having the usual suspects show up for a while until they get tired of it and then they don't.
I've actually said from time to time, if I were king of the flying club, and thank God I'm not, I would think very seriously about requiring some participation in maintenance night. The problem, of course, is then Ryan is faced every Wednesday night or Thursday night with a bunch of people who are there just because they're mandated to be there, and have probably no interest, no aptitude, and
That would be fun.
that's a nightmare. And I like Ryan too much, and I want him to be here for 30 years. And that seems like a really good way to make him think, there's a lot of opportunity out there for my skills.
Well, I wouldn't demand that the whole club be there every time, just put it that way, but have some schedule where people are and maybe a list of things that they're supposed to be familiar with. Have a little quiz. I mean, this is what it is to enforce a safety culture, is what I'm trying to say. This is the leadership thing that says, okay, maybe Ryan needs to take a few more hours off every day if he's going to be doing this. But the point being is that we need to cycle people through if we believe that this leads to safety, such as was just suggested by John Gaither. So I'm just going to ride that one for a little while, and I'll bring you some other examples too.
Yeah. I did, as I said, a quick back of the envelope calculation. John, you and I put our heads together a while back and tried to remember every accident or incident in which the club has participated over the years. And we could go back in our memory about as far as 1980, I think. And here is kind of what it looks like. Bear with me. And I have excised the names here because they're not really pertinent. And in a minute, if you want, we can look at some of these specifically and see what we can learn from them. But from 1980, and we don't keep these official records, but we put our heads together one night and had some participation from other people and looked at what would be about 25 years. And we had one fatality, which has become sort of notorious in the club. And we can talk about that if you want, but and when you start talking about fatal accidents, the numbers are so small that the statistics become kind of meaningless. But we've had we've had one fatality, and we've had 10 accidents. And as John can explain better than I can, the line between an accident and an incident is defined, but it is a little perplexing sometimes and a little counterintuitive. But John and I looked through this, and you can see in bold the accidents, and you can see, if you add them up, there are about 10 of them here. And we can look at those in detail later if we want. But so, the recent years we've been flying 6,000 to 7,000 hours a year. That has not always been the truth. So I just took a number, maybe 45 100 hours in some previous years. The club flew a lot back in the day, but if you take a number like that for the annual hours for the year, and you do the arithmetic, that comes out, 10 accidents for maybe 140,000. Comes out to about 7 point something for total accidents in 100,000 hours. And as you saw, that's about what the null reports for general aviation. It's actually a little higher. As you saw, the numbers usually run from 5 to maybe 6.5 per 100,000 hours. And you can take around, you can say, well, maybe over those 35 years, we flew 175,000 hours. That knocks it down to 5.7 or so. So that brings it back down. So, we're in that ballpark, and depending on how you tinker around with the denominator, we can make it a little bit lower than the average general aviation accident rate. We can make it a little bit higher, and we could spend a lot of time kind of going over those assumptions. But I would say it's kind of about average to a little above average, not shockingly above average. And again, we're dealing with small numbers here, even over 150 or 170,000 hours. And my math may be wrong, and call me on it if it is. If you look at fatal accidents, for us, it comes out to about, with those basic assumptions, it comes down to about 0.7 per 100,000 hours. But again, we've only had one fatality, so that really skews the numbers. But the national average over a number of years runs about 0.87 or so. So, well, that was 2016 for general aviation accidents. So, we're in the ballpark there. But again, when you're talking about one fatality in the numerator, I don't know how much you can make of those. I mean, imagine if it was 2. And one of those other accidents, which mercifully turned out to be, I can think of a couple offhand that if they had just gone the other way by a few feet would have been fatalities. So we're dealing with small numbers there. What does all that mean? I don't know. It means that, this is kind of what happens when people like us go out and fly airplanes. And anybody have any comments on that? I've got one more thing I want to say about that, but I don't want to just blather on here. Somebody unmute their mic and tell me what you're thinking. Okay, well, check and make sure everybody hasn't just gone.
Hey, George.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. I would just like to comment that the information that you just provided on the statistics, I mean, the null report, I would imagine, does not collect all of the reports, or doesn't factor in accidents that aren't reported. Because, I mean, I myself was in a pretty serious accident that never got reported as a passenger in the plane. And it never got reported. And you're counting every single accident and incident that the club has ever had.
No. I'm not counting incidents at all.
Okay, well, even if you're only counting accidents, I mean, you're counting the entire population of accidents that we've had, but the null report doesn't factor in all the countless accidents that never get reported.
I think, and we can talk about this, and I would bring John in on it. It is astonishing how bad you can destroy an airplane and have it not be an accident. The dividing line between an accident and an incident is pretty counterintuitive. Any fatalities in the accident you were involved in?
No.
The airplane was totaled, I assume.
It was heavily damaged. I mean, we had it, he towed it back across the ramp in the middle of the night without wheels.
That was probably an incident and not an accident. And we can go into some detail, but you can tear the gear off an airplane, you can bend the prop, you can do a lot of stuff to an airplane and have it not be an accident. And when I look back at the club, and John and I went over this, we weeded out all the incidents. There are over 30 if you count incidents along with the accidents. So we were very careful to consider only things that the NTSB and the FAA would consider an accident.
I mean, I consider the club to be extremely safe, and it's surprising we're no better than the average nationwide.
Well, I'm not going to say no better than. I'm just going to say that let's not kid ourselves. And my point is just that what we do is in many ways exactly what you would do if you wanted to create accidents. And why? Because we know accidents correlate with low time and type. So we teach you to fly in a 152, and then we move you up with a few hours into a 172. And then you want to check out in the Warrior, so we check you out in the Warrior. And then with 150 hours and an instrument rating, or 250 without an instrument rating, we'll put you in a Mooney, which you're not going to have an opportunity to do anywhere else with that much low time. So we are consistently moving people into airplanes in which they are unfamiliar, which absolutely correlates with accidents. We know that recent time correlates with accidents far more than total time. I mean, I may have 15, 18,000 hours, but if I haven't flown in 3 months, the safety that I believe I bring to the exercise is probably much less than I imagine. We know that accidents correlate with what I call, for lack of a better term, low time in the type of operation. Virtually every one of those 30 incidents and accidents, was someone who was new to that type of operation. One was a club member who landed on a grass runway up in the mountains for the very first time. She'd never landed on grass. It happened to be early morning and there'd been rain, there was dew. She had no idea that it's a pig on roller skates, and she wrapped the Cherokee around a tree. Another of those incidents or accidents was someone who had a new instrument rating and made a long instrument cross country at night, and was unfamiliar with a number of things about that kind of operation, and it led to an accident that if you did that 9 times again, you'd have 8 fatalities. It's kind of accident that people usually don't survive. And I could go on and on. Most of those things were people who were attempting a type of operation that was new to them. And that's what we do. That's what the Flying Club does. And I would argue that we keep our safety record, if you will, or our accident record as good as it is, and it is pretty good, by all the things we do to encourage safety. The quality of our training, which I think is well above any standard, regularity with which we encourage people to fly, the annual proficiency checks that we all subject ourselves to, the thoroughness of our checkouts, the written tests that we subject everybody to. I have people that call me up and want to join the Flying Club, and when they see what we're going to put them through for a checkout, they will look at me and say, you know, George, I've been flying for 35 years. I think I know what I'm doing. I really don't think I need some 25-year-old flight instructor to try to explain to me how to fly a Skyhawk. And I just say, you know, then you wouldn't be happy here, and what's the point of that? You know, there are plenty of other places you can fly, and we're unapologetic about the things we demand of our members, and in exchange, we give them tremendous latitude to make their own decisions. We don't look over your shoulder. We don't ask to see your flight plan. We don't ask to see your fuel planning. We don't check to see that you're current. We don't check your medical. We don't even check to see if you're sober. We just trust our members. We ask a lot of them in their commitment to safety, and then we trust them to use good judgment. And Grover, you've probably got your mic open, so the sound of your chewing gives us all a nice view.
My apologies. Had to have some ice cream.
Don't blame you a bit. I'm jealous, so I don't want to watch you eat it. So,
Okay, thank you.
that's fine. You know, if my mic is open and I make noise, then you get to watch me. So anyway, I don't want to dispute the nature of the accident or incident that you had, Louis, but I'm aware that you can do a lot of damage to an airplane and it's not an accident. So again, we can quibble about the statistics. This is a back of the envelope calculation, but my point is just that we need to do all of these things, because what we are doing is putting people in situations where accidents happen, and we're not immune to that.
Well, George, you're absolutely correct. That one of the points that I make in this, what I put out in 2014.
Yeah, John, how do I know that accidents correlate with low time and type and low recent time? So, because I learned it in your ground school in 1975.
That's true. And it's also in the Null report.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's not a mystery, but you have beat that into my head for 35 years.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and we are a training organization, whereas if you compare us to airlines or corporate aviation, they're not starting with novices. We're at that end, and all the training done in all turbine airplanes for practical purposes on a routine basis are done in simulators. And guess what? Those do crash, and they're never reported because they're not required to. In other words, there are pilots who get in there and screw it up and reset, walk away. You know, what can you say? So
sure, and it's worse. We also do something different than flight schools. The flight school, you go and they teach you to fly, and then you go away and fly somebody else's airplane.
Right.
You come to us knowing nothing. We teach you to fly, and then we hand you the keys to our airplanes, and that's a whole different level of commitment than your average flight school.
Yeah. No, and I'm just pushing on this here, and we could learn from the problems that we did have with situations. I don't remember the young man's name, but you'll remember he came down from Toledo, and he wanted to fly one of our Cherokee Warriors, and he started to check out with I've seen a moment here. One of our instructors, elderly instructor, who's very good. And he got upset. He said, he's trying to rip me off for money. It's going to take like 4 or 5 hours to finish my checkout, he says. And by God, I'm a private pilot. That's ridiculous. You're just milking me for money. So then Stan Munzat took him over, if you'll remember.
Yeah,
and
we'll show you exactly who you're talking about.
Right. And the point is that we could have seen this coming a mile away and should have not allowed him to solo our airplanes. But the trouble is with the business we're in, and the people who have been around the field a little bit, especially those who learn how to fly elsewhere, have this notion that it's kind of a right and privilege rolled into one. And if we started to get stricter, it would be, well, I'm out of here because everybody else thinks I'm safe, and you guys are just snooty and don't know what you're talking about. So we succumb to that in this case. To give the example of it here, we let him fly, and he flew against the recommendations from Stan, who wanted to fly with less winds, but he took off the airplane and flew it with crosswinds when he shouldn't have and crashed the airplane. Walked away, quit the club, of course.
Yeah, it was over at Triple W.
Triple W, you bet it was.
8330 Sierra. He had complained because he thought Gene Weaver was milking him for money and prolonging his checkout. And he actually expressed that to you. He switched instructors.
Yep.
And, he took off and flew over to Triple W. And I read the accident report today. The winds were 10 gusting to 16, but they were not a direct crosswind. And he just lost control of the airplane, went left, wrapped it around the tree. Airplane was destroyed. And it was his first flight after his checkout.
Right.
And he looked at the chart. I remember talking to him. He looked at the chart and said, "Oh, it would be fun to go to a different airport. I've never been over there. I'll go over to Triple W today." And any of us who've been over to Triple W knows that it's, people fly in and out of there all the time, have for years, but it's not a 6,000 foot wide runway, flat with clear approaches like Sanford. Down in a bowl, and it's surrounded by trees, and the winds are swirly, and it looks pretty narrow if you're used to 150 foot wide runway. And it was not his day. Cost us an airplane.
Yeah. Well, what I'm saying is that how do we as an organization become more savvy? Because that had all the earmarks. He showed up at the club with, I believe, 50 hours and a private pilot certificate. What does that tell you in modern times? That basically he was not trained very well, or he was the most amazing ace around. And the way both Gene and Stan worked with him, it was clear it was not the latter. And how do we? I mean, Stan trusted him that he would go by the rules, which he didn't in terms of crosswind and all this. But and I talked to him, after the fact. And he said, "Well, I saw everybody else out there flying. I'm a private pilot too. I'm checked out in the airplane. I think I'll just fly too." It just assuming that the whole attitude was, "I'm as good as anybody else, and you can't stop me." So how do we work with that? How do we devise a culture to make sure that we don't allow that kind of thing to happen?
Oh, I think we have. It's just not perfect because these are personal interactions and they are judgment calls. One of the difficult things about doing checkouts or soloing a student is, how many times has a student looked at me and said, "I think I'm ready to solo," and I'll say, "I just am not confident in your ability to land the airplane consistently." And they'll say, "Well, I just did 3 good landings. How many do I have to do? 5, 10, 20? And I just have to look at them and say, "I cannot give you a number. You just are at the mercy of my very analog, very ambiguous gut sense of whether this is going to be consistent or whether I've just seen 3, 5, 10 good landings and the next one is going to go sideways. And I cannot give you a metric." And with that, sometimes we misjudge. But our checkouts are more thorough than anyone else I've seen.
That's true. Yeah, and I have a story about that one. That when I went to check out a 172 in Maui, just to a joyride to see it, got there and they basically looked at my certificate. We got in the airplane when one trapper in the pattern says, "You can fly, what the heck," And I wasn't going to disagree with him, but boy, I thought that would never happen where I come from. So
Yeah,
it's in the business,
and
and it's what the assumption is.
we talk about checklists a lot, you and I. And I think I said to you the other day, I'm absolutely convinced you cannot get general aviation pilots to consistently use a checklist unless you can fire them and take away their job. And I've been trying for years. And there are reasons why in general aviation it's hard. Single pilot, sometimes without an autopilot. There are a lot of things that figure into that. But I see, I don't don't see any other than Dwight. I'd like to hear from him. And I see Glenn Roan on here, who is a member of our club for a few years and is currently employed by an airline. And I would love it if he would open his mic. And he also does a lot of training for his airline. And I'd love to hear his thoughts on what the club could do or how it compares. I know, John, you've been involved in the airlines. You even started an airline one time. We should talk about that story sometime. But if Glenn is willing, I'd love to hear his thoughts on all this.
Is the mic open? Okay.
Yeah, it is.
Okay. One is
You've heard us grapple with all this, and
it's good that you have a you may not call it a formal safety management system, but it seems like that's what you're putting together. So that's good. And keeping the information that you have and then learning from it. The only observation that I would make when I have been involved in flight safety investigations at the airline, one of the things that we have, or one of the pieces that come out of it after we do the flight safety investigation, which is led by a whole team, in any incident or accident, there's a remediation portion. And so that's the only thing that I might suggest that maybe think about when you do have an incident or an accident. Do you have a formalized system where the board gets together and says, well, we need to meet, and a couple members of the board with the chief flight instructor and say, well, let's put a remediation plan together for this individual so that this doesn't happen again, and do we need to change any of the criteria, for people at the club? So.
Yeah, we do have a process for that. Anyone at the club who is involved in an accident or incident, just by our SOPs, their flight privileges are suspended, and then we take some time to look at the situation and decide, how to move forward from it. I think the club has always had sort of an informal policy. This is not written anywhere necessarily, but if we have what I would call a failure of technique, somebody goes sideways, wraps an airplane around a tree. I've always taken the approach, and I think the club has, that we all share it because we taught you to fly or we checked you out. So at least implicitly, we're saying you're capable to fly the airplane under these circumstances. Those circumstances are defined in the club SOPs and flight standards.
Right.
We have weather prescriptions and so on, and we are implicitly saying that we have found you safe to do this. So if it turns out that you're not, if you have a failure of technique, we feel like we all sort of share in that because we were all wrong. And we take a constructive view of that. We get together with that pilot and we try to figure out what the problem was, and we do remedial training and try to solve it.
George,
failures of what I call willful disregard of safety, of club SOPs, of FAA regulations. We take a much harsher view of those. That's kind of a zero tolerance for those situations, and we've had a few of those, and we kind of break it out that way. We have provisions for a safety committee, which has kind of fallen by the wayside recently, and I think it might very well be worth recreating that. And that would be sort of like what you're talking about, an investigating committee or something. The board has kind of served that purpose lately, but it's not really the board's expertise. You know,
Right.
people on the board who know how to manage the club, not necessarily how to look at an accident like that. John, I think you were saying something and I cut you.
Yeah, there's a couple of factors here to speak to the suggestion, which is excellent. It's my impression, and you probably have statistics, George, that I've not looked at specifically, that most all of the accidents we've had, and I can only think of one or two exceptions, that we haven't had the opportunity for remediation because the members who had the accidents promptly quit. They're just, and the way I've seen it, they're just too embarrassed to stay, so they're gone. So we don't have that opportunity.
That's actually in a sense not true, because we constantly have things, I say constantly, but we frequently have things that don't even appear among that list of 30 things. We had a student pilot recently who locked up the brakes on landing in a 152 and went sideways and rolled into the dirt and destroyed a tire. Ryan, I'm sure, remembers this because he took care of it. Destroyed a tire and ended up, 15 feet off the runway. And that doesn't even appear in our statistics. But I got in touch with him. I told him, he was standing down until we sorted this out. I got with his instructor, I got with him, and we looked at the situation. And that sort of thing happens frequently in the club. It just doesn't. We had twice in the last year, we've had pilots basically land on fumes. And that doesn't appear in the statistics either. But in both cases, we canceled their flying privileges and had a serious sit down with them and looked at why it happened and how it happened and so on.
But were they in my ground school ever?
Yes.
Oh, that's embarrassing.
Yes. John, it's not a lack of knowledge. It's a lack of discipline. It's not that people, I mean, hell, I'm the same way. I know all this stuff, and someday we'll have a meeting like this and we'll all fess up. You and I talked about this when I started flying all those years ago. I would look at accidents and I'd think, be very small again and think, I got nothing to worry about because these people are obviously idiots. And I'm not. Turns out I'm the same kind of idiot. And many of them were probably better husbands, fathers, and citizens than I am, and probably better pilots. But your ground school, if I were king of the flying club, I would make everybody in the flying club sit through the first 3 sessions of your private ground school, at least once every 2 or 3 years. I don't care if they get 20,000 hours. You would enjoy having Glenn in your class.
Oh, I know I would.
Well, George, something you just brought up is actually kind of interesting because, as most of you know, I was.
I'm going to interrupt you just to say, most of you probably know, but John has been president of the club in the past, has done incredible work for the club, has chaired a club fleet committee that did a lot of really good work. And one night I'd like to have John talk to us about how the fleet committee went about its business. But John and I disagreed about a lot of things, but when he talks, I listen.
Well, I don't think you'll disagree with me on this one. But you will recall that in the first year that I was president, and for that matter, in a number of years before when I'd been on the board, we had never had an accident or an incident. And I, of course, felt pretty good about that. And then in the second year I was president, I think we had at least 4 and I think 5 incidents. And the club was extremely frustrated and took a lot of actions at the time, but it was certainly a wake-up call, and 3 of them cost us a heck of a lot of money. But the point I was trying to get at was there is a very fine line between what you were talking about that were near misses as opposed to incidents that were not near misses. And I think that learning from near misses and taking action on near misses has actually been a strength of the club. And this isn't my idea. You and I have both read the same books on that issue. But I do think the club has been very proactive in trying to get at those issues. And we've had some of the incidents that we had. I think that 3 of the people stayed with the club and 2 of them self-selected out of the club, if my memory's right.
John is correct. Some of the people who have been involved in the worst accidents have decided that they're going to fly elsewhere or perhaps not fly. But a lot of people that hung in there who have been involved in some of these incidents in any case. One of my favorites, which John was personally involved in, John went over to Causey over at Liberty one time because someone had landed there and blown out a tire in the Mooney. So John went over there to try and deal with the issue, and he needed some more tools, or maybe another tube, I don't know. But he called up one of the club instructors, who was an elder of the club, and asked him to bring some of the supplies John needed over to Causey. And so he jumped in a Mooney, flew over there, landed, and promptly blew out his tire. So, you know, I don't know, what are you going to do? But John, you and I have gone around and around a few times about the way we do our annual proficiency checks.
Yep.
Do you want to share your view on that?
Well, I'm not sure we're as far apart as you sometimes characterize us as being on that issue.
Well,
But
hyperbole.
what I would like to see, well, I believe, and I believe the statistics bear with me, that periodic training is at least as beneficial and probably more beneficial than studying up for a test once a year.
Yep.
As a result, I would very much like to see the club adopt something similar to the FAA's Wings program, where if you fly a certain amount with instructors and you go through particular exercises, then you don't have to do a club annual. When I was flying frequently and was at the club in North Carolina, when life permitted it, I had sort of a goal of flying at least an hour and a half every month with an instructor. And I thought that during the period of time when I was able to do that, I felt my skills were at a much higher level than they were when I went for periods where I didn't do that. Because we might be doing, say, instrument approaches, but I would get a little coaching that maybe that last landing was kind of approaching flat, and you ought to wake up on that, or whatever, because they observed things that about technique that I didn't. So I still believe it would be a desirable idea for the club to put something together on that, and I think they could piggyback on the FAA's Wings program to do it.
We may not be as far apart on that. Hyperbole is my form of argument, but I try to get people in the club to understand that our annual proficiency check has specific things that have to be accomplished, but they don't all have to be accomplished on a given day once a year. If I have an instrument student, for instance, and we are flying regularly, and we make a landing, or we'll throw in a short field landing, for instance, at the end of an approach, and check that off. And over time, that sheet on which we itemize everything, fills up with things that have been accomplished over the course of a month or 3 months or 6 months or a year. And when it's all checked off within the last year, I can sign that off as an annual proficiency check. I don't, if someone has been doing instrument training with Heinz or with one of our instructors and has been flying 50 approaches in the last 3 months, he doesn't need to get in an airplane with me and go out and do more approaches. I just need to have Heinz' signature on that form that says, yeah, he's done these. But, it's complicated and we create these processes and they get more and more complicated. And I'm always trying to remember that there are those of us for whom the club and flying is a huge part of our life and we think about it every day. But there are a lot of members who it's just a small part of their life and it's something they do occasionally. And keeping track of all of our requirements and how they can be done or should be done is not something they think about every day. So we have to find ways to simplify as much as we can. So it's a dilemma.
Well, and I'd like just to add that what you're saying there is something that is a dilemma that's going to be in general aviation, and it's going to drive the safety record of general aviation as opposed to, say, the airlines. This fact of the matter, that professionals who are flying essentially every week for multiple tens of hours, sometimes it just can't be compared to an amateur who can't afford to do that and shows up, once a month to do a little flying or less or more. And how are you going to do that? I mean, this is the dilemma that I try to address. That if we want the kind of safety that the American certified airplanes have now, airlines have now, which is a ridiculous safety record, just amazing. That it would be draconian. I mean, no one would do it. So we are in that dilemma of if we're going to have amateur aviation by people who can barely afford it, we're going to have a problem. And the way around that can be solved by cutting out flexibility and convenience. That is, making rules that make it so onerous to fly that basically they can't use it to take a trip because the trip might be scheduled on a certain date, and then the weather's that we decreed that they have to take into consideration doesn't quite meet the minimums. They cancel their flight. This kind of stuff. To try to get safety anywhere near what the airlines have, for instance, is just going to be well nigh impossible unless you really look at what we can do that will either take the convenience away and basically you only fly once every little bit, only when the weather's good type of thing. And people are always going to want to push that.
No one imagines that we can be as safe as airline flying. I mean, that's ludicrous.
Right.
But I take what you mean. It's always a balance. We require more of our members than almost any other kind of rental situation. And you reach a point of diminishing returns. And as you say, you make it too onerous, too difficult to track. And, you take not just the fun out of it, but the utility out of it. It's hard to know where to draw the line. And our procedures are complex. I mean, we got a handbook that's like, this thick now. So it's always a balance. And I don't know the answer. I think we do a heck of a good job, actually. My point is not that we're doing a bad job. My point is that if we weren't doing such a good job, as Glenn says, we have effectively a safety management system, which is just, from the top down management all the way down to the instructors and the members. We always talk about safety and work toward it. My point is, if we didn't do that, we'd be a bloodbath.
Yeah, well, here I have a question to ask you. PIOs have been the bane of our existence, porpoising on landings, and so it is in the whole industry. We know that. And what are we doing to be really effective about that? If we know that's one of the most common things that happens,
Well,
can we
every
do more?
every year, you or I or both of us send out a rant about that.
Yeah.
And we talk to our instructors about it all the time. And I don't get to do all the Mooney checkouts of the instructors anymore. They're checking each other out, which is fine. But I hope I make it a powerful point of emphasis anytime I get to work with one of the instructors about teaching in the Mooney in particular. I mean, it happens to other airplanes. You know, we've destroyed 172 that way. You know, you can show me any airplane and I'll find a way to prang it.
Yeah.
But we have made that a point of emphasis in recent years, and we have not had any damaging PIOs for quite a while now, but that could just be random distribution. But we make that a point of emphasis.
Okay, well, I was just pushing on that to say there's an example of a classic example where at least I know we've had 5 or 6 of them, maybe not in the last few years, but 5 or 6 in the last, say, 20 some years. And you know, no one was hurt, but they sure messed up our record with the insurance company. How are we acting on that? And what you're saying is we're making the point of emphasis right now. Is it formalized or just something that you've taken on? I'm trying to get back to, a safety culture that formalizes things.
Well, how would you formalize it? I'll just ask that. How would you formalize it? It's been, as far as I can tell, I don't think we've had a PIO in probably 15 years.
No, really? It wasn't.
I don't know. Doesn't matter.
Hey, George.
But how would you formalize it?
Well, you're talking to me, right? Well, okay. I would actually write it up and put it in our standard operating procedures. That this is one of the things that will be discussed in great detail by the instructors with every annual checkout, and then give them some videos to watch. And so that would be an example, as opposed to have it just being in our verbal culture and this kind of stuff.
Okay, that's a good answer. There may actually be mention of it in the flight standards or the SOPs now, but I don't recall. But yeah, no, that's why I asked the question. Who else? I mean, John and I, particularly me, have been talking way too much. Who else has a specific suggestion that they would like to see the club do differently or do better when it comes to this? And it's okay if somebody out there thinks we do too much already, and stuff happens.
So I have a question actually that might lead to a suggestion. John, a couple of minutes ago, brought up the subject of minimums, and it actually caught my attention from the standpoint of I'm a little surprised we actually made it this long in the discussion without like a serious talk about minimums directly. And it's a very pertinent safety topic.
That's
It's
next
something
week.
that the instructors are really good at, setting up students as they're passing check rides with some idea of some minimums and sending you off. And maybe we check in on those once a year during the club annual. But as a private pilot who's out and trying to grow and improve and so on, my question is, how should we be thinking about how do I expand my minimums? When do I know that it's the right time to find out if my minimums are where I think they are? Like how should that evolve over time? What are my best practices?
That's a really good question, Michael. And I would like to do a session on flight risk assessment tools as well. I've looked at a lot of those, and we're familiar with the risk matrix idea, but the flight risk assessment tools can be really useful. And the whole idea of personal minimums, we know. But Glenn could explain to us how that works in the airlines. But it raises a real question. And I'll tell you a story. Back when we were in Chapel Hill, this would have been in the 90s, we had a club member, and there's a point to this. We had a club member who we taught to fly, and he checked out in the Warrior, and he was low time, 10 hours or something in the Warrior. And I'll try to hurry through this. I show up at the airport one day, and he's there. Extremely nice guy, extremely smart. He was a computer science professor at UNC. His wife worked during the week at Penn State up in State College, Pennsylvania. I said, hey, how are you? And he said, oh, I'm going to fly up to see my wife. I said, oh, that's great. And I said, you know that there's a front due through later today. And he said, oh, yeah, I've looked at all that. And I said, okay, have a nice trip. And that night, I was working at the radio station. He calls me up about 11:30 and said, just wanted to chat. And I instantly knew we did not have that kind of relationship. Long story short, he said, yeah, it was a great trip. The landing was a little rough, but, it went fine. And I immediately knew, no, of course it didn't. So called up the FBO up there the next day, and they said, yeah, he porpoised down the runway 2 or 3 times. The nose gears collapsed. It was a gross prop strike. You're going to look at an engine tear down. And, we can help you with it. We estimate like 50 grand or something like that. And so anyway, we had a talk about it later. And he said to me something I'll never forget. He said, George, yeah, I knew that it was going to be windy and it was nighttime, and I'm new to kind of this, but how am I ever going to get better if I don't challenge myself? And I said, John, you got half of it. Yeah, you absolutely have to challenge yourself, but challenge yourself in a way where you've got a safety net. Take me with you, where if anything bad happens, it's my fault. Where else can you get that for, in those days, $15 an hour? The way you do that is you put yourself in a situation where you challenge yourself with a safety net. And that safety net can be another runway close by that's aligned with the wind. So you go out and try those 15-knot crosswind. And, after you figure out that maybe this is too much, you can go find the runway where it's right down the runway, or take an instructor with you where, have at it. If anything bad happens, it's my fault. And there are other ways you can do that. And if people get half of it right, but, the guy's new to the club, new to the airplane, just finishes checkout and looks at the chart and says, I think I want to go find an airport I've never been to. And so what if it's only 3,500 feet long? I want to challenge myself. Bad idea.
Yeah. Well, to answer the question about personal minimums, 121 carriers have this solved for them. Anytime that a captain moves into a new type of airplane, automatically he has higher minimums for 100 hours, and end of discussion. We can institute something like that.
Absolutely. We don't call it micromanage, whatever. Our pilots, we trust them to make those kind of judgments. And that is a wonderful privilege, I think. But some of them make bad judgments.
Yeah.
I could say, Michael, you're going to check out in the Mooney. Your minimums are, 2,000 feet or 3,000 feet or VFR or, a 5-knot crosswind. And, I would not have taken the Cub out today because my crosswind limit is about 7 knots. And those are my personal minimums. I kind of like the fact that I get to make that decision on my own. We have talked, I hope your instructors have talked to you about personal minimums and about concepts like flight risk assessment tools, which are a way of exerting discipline on us, because what I've seen time and time again, and I'm sure you've seen, is that we tend to cherry pick the information we want. I cannot tell you how many times, I've had a discussion about whether a student's going to solo today or fly today, and they'll say, yeah, 4,000 feet. It's a great day to fly. And yeah, have you looked at the forecast, which says that at 6 o'clock, the wind's going to be 25 knots? But the flight risk assessment tools is a way to stop kidding ourselves. You know, how much have you flown in the last 30 days? How much time do you have in this airplane? How much sleep have you had? How much, you know, on and on and on. And I'd like to talk about those some days. We could do a whole program on them.
Yeah.
The twin
Well,
set.
I think for safety, and all I'm trying to advance here, George, is that their professionals have it nailed down. That's why I gave the example of the high minimum captains when they move a different type of airplane, move up, and if you can do that in a professional thing, surely we can do it in an amateur thing. Unless what we're saying is we can't, because the expectation is the amateurs get to take more risks. The expectation is that it's okay for us to have accidents. It's not okay for the airlines. And so we just have to put up with it. I'm going to challenge that.
Well, obviously my role here is to play devil's advocate. But so how do we enforce that? Does Michael have to call me up every time he goes flying and have a conversation about the weather and we compare it to our personal minimums? Or do we do what we do now, which is try to coach people about those concepts and the temptations therein and trust them to make those decisions?
Well, that's general aviation for you, because that's the whole point. I mean, and the FAA is complicit in this. Just the idea of Part 91 general aviation. It's okay. You can attempt an approach, and even if if the reporting is 0, it's below minimums, and you can fly that. Whereas again, the professionals are prohibited from that. They can't even start the approach. And what's wrong with that picture?
Well, what's wrong with Michael having to call me up every time he wants to go flying and compare the weather with his personal minimums, which I keep on a file on my computer?
Well, no, I'm suggesting it's a one size fits all. That's what I'm suggesting. So no one has to call you up because they know what the score is.
So we publish a set of personal minimums that apply to the brand new private pilot who just passed his check ride.
Yep.
And applies equally well to, I'm not going to pick anybody else out by name, but a very experienced pilot who is flying an airplane that they have a lot of time in and a lot of
no, they're customized. It's one size fits all, means that for this particular experience level, these are your minimums. For this experience, these are your minimum. You graduate, and it's known ahead of time.
So how many different experience levels do we have? Or do we have a flight risk assessment tool that everybody has to fill out and put a number next to every one of the 23 different elements of a good flight risk assessment tool? And if they score 25, they can't go. If they score 22, they can go.
Well, that's a different approach. But in other words, I'm not recommending that we do it today, but I'm recommending we think about doing what the airlines do. And that is, it's all in the regs. They do it, and no one complains. They deal with it.
Michael, what do you think?
Thanks, Michael.
I think that's a wonderful discussion. I like the idea of just discussing minimums more and finding some more formalized way to keep it an active part of the conversation. It's something that I think a lot of new pilots struggle to navigate the evolution of, and eventually you sort of get the hang of it after a couple of annuals and talking with instructors more and being around and that sort of thing. But it's a tough topic. It's interesting to consider the idea of you know, the club already imposes some minimums on all of our pilots, right? We have fuel minimums that are higher than the FAA's. We have runway length minimums and this kind of stuff. We could put some extra minimums for your first 25 hours in a new type. Those minimums are higher, or maybe your weather minimums are particular or something like that. And that might apply even pretty well across experience levels if it's your first time in a Mooney or whatever it might be. But it sounds like the kind of thing that a safety committee might take up. I'm also taking that away from this.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you there. You know, when you check out an airplane at the club, there's that yellow sheet that sits next to the computer, and there's a column in there that refers in one way or another to the weather. How many people do you think actually give that a thought when they put a checkbox in that column? And my suggestion is a number statistically indistinguishable from zero.
I know for certain that there's 4 columns, and if you made me name them, I'm sure I couldn't.
Yeah, I'm not sure I could either, but I'm pretty sure that one of them refers to the fact that I've gotten a weather briefing. And I would stand by my assumption that basically nobody gives that a moment's thought. I'm not saying they don't get a weather briefing. I'm just saying, you know, now we put a flight risk assessment tool there with 23 different items on it. I'm obviously what you're hearing is not me disagreeing with these principles at all. I spend every day thinking about it. What you hear is my frustration with how to make these things happen. I see someone mentioned in the chat here that one of the things we could do is if we could set up those kind of minimums, and in a sense we do with runway length and that sort of thing, and say if you exceed those minimums and something bad happens, you pay for the damage. The club wants no part of it. I don't know, but that's an innovative way to look at it. You know, every insurance underwriter, if you know, we've had a discussion in the board recently about the FAA has extended, essentially will forgive your medical if it expires between now and the end of June. You can continue to fly, and the FAA said they will not enforce, they will not violate you for flying with an expired medical, because we all know that that's difficult in these times. The underwriters, and we talked the other night about we need to check with our underwriter, because the underwriter does not necessarily say that they're going to forgive. You know, if your medical is expired, even though the FAA doesn't care, your underwriter may say you're flying outside the policy. We're not helping. So that's an interesting way to go about enforcing things. So I'd like to talk. I mean, we've been going on a long time, and I've occupied too much time, but I would like to talk about this some more. I would like to do a whole program on flight risk assessment tools. I think it'd be really interesting, because the good ones have like 25 categories, and each one of them is something that we don't always think about when we go flying. It'd be interesting to talk about each one of them. So I'm going to shut up for a minute here and just ask, you know, who else has something they want to talk about or something they want to say, or and if not, we can, you know, we can call it a night. You know, I'll go on about this stuff forever.
Hey, George, before we hang up here, I would just know what is the plane that is just over John's left shoulder?
I'm sorry, what is?
What is the plane that is just over John's left shoulder?
Oh, okay.
I can barely see it.
Let's hold it up and see if anybody else can guess. I know what it is, so I will. I won't say anything. Anybody want to guess? This, I'll give you a hint. This was part of John's ill-fated airline.
John needs to say something in order for us to see the plane.
Oh, sorry. Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Is that a sob?
No.
John, talk to us about it so we can see it.
Okay, sorry. Yes, can you see it now? I'll keep talking. Okay, is that it? All right.
Yep.
Yep. It's not a Saab, no. It's the first of a line of business airplanes that are flying today.
Think of the most glamorous business airplane you can think of.
Gulfstream.
Yeah.
Bingo.
Yep, that's what it is. It's the original G1. The fuselage is still the same as the latest Gulfstreams. This is a different with the same airline. You recognize this, right? You know what that is, right?
I should, but I don't remember.
Yeah. Well, this is a 727-100. You know how to tell the difference between a 100 and a 200? Well, they are different length, but in case you're not good at judging the length of the airplane, you look at the inlet and the number 2 engine. It's an oval for a 100 series 727. It's round for a 200 series 727. But don't worry, most all of them are retired in the world. They're not flying anymore anyway.
Oh, John, we all knew that. We all knew that.
It's a heck of an airplane. I could go on forever about the 727. It's the only one that has a wing and the triple double slotted Fowler flaps that make this sucker, which can cruise at Mach 8.4 all the way down. It lands at extremely slow speeds. And so here's the question about a 727 like this. If you take one of these with adequate fuel reserves of an hour or so, and you land it with a light load, and you land it because you're at 121 required to do this, or large airplane you are at the recommended speed, and you clear the threshold by 50 feet minimum. This is the 50 feet is what you're supposed to. You touch down 1,000 feet down the runway. What total distance from the beginning of the runway does this airplane stop in under those conditions? Oh, and you can say the nose wheel brakes do not work, and reverse thrust does not work.
I've heard this before.
Yeah, total distance from the end of the runway. You come in over the end of the runway at 50 feet, and you touch down 1,000 feet down the runway.
No reverse thrust.
Let's say 4,000, 4,500.
No, the key is that it can stop in around after it's touched down. It can stop in around 300 feet.
What?
Yes. Because under those conditions, it is very lightweight, and it's flying at that point. The VREF at that light weight is something like 105 knots, which is not that fast. I mean, the Cherokee 6 would be 90 knots, for instance. So it's or can be. So it just it has very good brakes, spoilers and brakes. This does the job.
I'm happy if I can stop the Cub in 300 feet.
This is after you've touched down, George.
Yeah, I know.
John, did these planes have some variety of anti-lock brakes?
Yes, they do. Yes. Yeah, you can stomp on them, and it depends which system it is, but you can feel it. It gives a good as it unlocks just to keep them barely rolling. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Funny story. At Oshkosh a couple of years ago, I was walking along with one of our young flight instructors, and we saw these beautiful piston cabin class sort of retro airplanes, kind of a swooping belly, they were just beautiful. You walk up, you look inside, it was cabinet work, just beautiful wooden cabinet work. They were just elegant. I don't know how many, well, John tell us in a minute, I'm sure, but I don't know how many seats there were, maybe 10, 12, 14.
Yeah. You're talking
And,
about the Howards.
I'm telling the story, John, because you're the hero of the story. So
Oh, never mind.
it's not fair for you to tell it. So I had no idea what this was. There were 3 of them there, and they were just beautiful. I had no idea what it was, and the young flight instructor with me did not know either. And so she, of course, went out on all of her 50,000 Twitter followers and crowdsourced to try and find out what airplane it was, and got back all kinds of different answers. So we're sitting at breakfast at the college the next morning, and John's sitting there with us, and we kind of look at all the answers she got, trying, well, is this or is this? And I said, show John the picture, and she shows him the picture, and John says, oh, that was the Howard 500, and that was a very successful business airplane that came along just at the jet era was beginning, and so it really never had a market, but they re-engineered it with this engine and that engine and so on, and I'm thinking, okay, that's the difference between being 30 years old and having 5,000 Twitter followers and just knowing everything about the history of aviation. It was really kind of funny.
I don't remember that. That's interesting.
No, yeah, I mean, you took one look at it, oh, that's the Howard 500, and told us the whole story about it. And we're sitting there trying to figure out, among all these different cockamamie answers that she got.
Yeah.
So I always said going to Oshkosh with John is like having your own docent at the museum.
Well, it's time to say goodnight, George.
It is. Absolutely, yes. Thank everybody for hanging in there. I would like to do this on a regular basis just so we can all kind of keep in touch. I hope other instructors will jump in and create content and do things of their own. But Dwight has created a tool for them and for the members to perhaps create ideas and inspire them, and that's kind of all we can do. So thanks for your patience. Let me know what you think. You can send it by email if you want. I'll say good night.
Good night.
Thank you, George.
Good night,
Thanks,
guys.
man.
The interesting thing about the Howard 500, George, is it's actually a converted Lockheed Lodestar, but it's extremely converted.
That's right. I remember you told us that.
Yeah.
Yeah, you give us the whole history of it, and I went back and looked it up, of course.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I was intrigued with that airplane years and years and years ago because one of my favorite airplanes, the Lockheed Constellation. And there's a connection there, and that is that when they were designing the Constellation, they couldn't figure out, I don't know, whatever reason they needed a much bigger engine, of course, to put in a Lockheed Constellation, and they couldn't figure out what to flight test it on. They didn't have a wind tunnel to put it in, so they just bolted this engine on a Lockheed Lodestar. There's this monstrous engine, but the Lodestar can handle it. They went and tested, just the horsepower and all the the new propeller they're going to use. You can find that picture still today, I think, of the Lockheed Lodestar with these monster engines on them. And so the guys who took it to convert it for a business airplane knew that they had a good airframe, and they did up the engine, but not to the one that's on the Constellation.
Well, I just loved it because of its lines and because it had a retro look about it.
Yeah, Art Deco almost. Yeah.
Art Deco almost.
Yeah.
And it was so distinctive, and I couldn't believe that I'd never seen one before.
Yeah. Well, they were popular for a few years, and they're extremely hard to fly. There's still a couple of them flying. They're obviously because you saw them at Oshkosh
Yeah.
years ago. But you really have to know your stuff if you have an engine out because they're so ridiculously overpowered. And you gotta think quick if you lose one.
I couldn't figure out how you could land it without dragging the belly.
Right.
Literally the belly was down in the grass.
That's right. Well, if all three gear come down, it will clear by a few inches.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a beautiful airplane.
Yeah.
I used to say that, if I won the lottery, I would try and find myself a DC-3 and fly all my friends to Oshkosh. But
Yeah.
I think if I won the lottery, I'd try and find one of those. I don't have that many friends.
Right. Yeah.
It would be a great way to travel.
It would. They had those big engines on them. They rivaled the G1. No two ways about it.
Wow.
A lot more maintenance expenses, but that's not a matter.
Oh, I can imagine it would be a nightmare to maintain.
It is. Yeah, that's what I keep reading. You have to be wealthy, and this one guy owns two of them.
I mean, it looks like one of those airplanes where it's basically just a continuous restoration.
Right.
More than maintenance.
Yeah. Well, let me see. You have any ideas for next week?
Good question. Let me stop the recording here. If I can figure out how. Pause.